I'm Dr. Judy Melinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So, for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Also, for any kind of traumatic injuries. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they're exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning, and the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now, identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And the other thing you have to consider, and there's one other important piece of information from that press conference, which is that the neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office that was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. So I hope this answers some questions about what I saw in the press conference, what other people saw as well. I will go through the autopsy, or at least the report that's been released, with a fine-tooth comb, but this is just my first impressions based on watching the press report.
There's a word forensic pathologists use that most people have never had a reason to learn: diagnosis of exclusion. It means you don't get to call something a drowning just because a body was found in water. You have to rule out everything else first. Nobody ruled out everything else first in this case. Not close. Tonight we're going to walk through exactly why a board-certified forensic pathologist, someone with no connection to either side of this case, has looked at what's public so far and said she can't be certain the official read is right. We're also going to bring you something brand new. At the National Urban League Convention, Nolan's own legal team just announced they've brought in some of the top audio engineering experts in the country to formally examine that emergency call, the real one, start to finish. Not a hobbyist's AI pass, not a TikTok enhancement, a real, professional, forensic review. We're going to be careful with this tonight, because it would be easy to take a real forensic question and turn it into something louder than the evidence actually supports. We're not going to do that. We're going to lay out exactly what a doctor with real credentials has actually said, in her own words, and exactly where the honest uncertainty in this case actually lives. Type file open if you are ready for this one.
Tonight, we're breaking down the preliminary findings of that second autopsy. I spoke with Dr. Judy Melinek, a board-certified pathologist who is not affiliated with this case, about the report. So in cases where a body is found in or around water, what do forensic pathologists tend to look out for when conducting an autopsy?
When a body's in water, it's not always clear whether they died as a result of being in the water, meaning that they drowned, or they died of something else and they were just disposed of in the water. So if there is traumatic injury to the body, like a stab wound or a gunshot wound or strangulation, that would kill the person, generally we will defer to that as the cause of death. We will say the cause of death is the trauma and being in the water is irrelevant. Versus if we find, for example, a natural disease process like a heart attack, then if a person had a heart attack while they were swimming, we would still call that a drowning, but we would acknowledge the heart disease as a significant contributing condition. And the same thing would apply for something like drugs or alcohol that incapacitate you and cause you to drown. The cause of death would be drowning, but we would put the drugs or the alcohol as a significant contributing condition.
In the preliminary discussion of the report, the forensic pathologist mentioned several limitations he encountered, one being the absence of several neck structures. For most people, that kind of sounds odd that the body was sent without those parts, but as the report states, that's actually a common forensic pathology practice. Can you explain why those structures might have been kept during the initial autopsy?
So the neck structures would be where you would see any evidence of injury to the neck or potentially strangulation injury. Retaining those structures does not necessarily mean that they have trauma there. They may have been retained out of an abundance of caution, but they may have also shown some sort of injury or disease process like obstruction that necessitated their being kept by the medical examiner because it's evidence. So retaining tissue or organs in a high profile or suspicious case is common practice for a medical examiner and is not sign of any kind of conspiracy or cover up. That is exactly what the medical examiner is supposed to do when they have a case where they either find trauma or they don't find trauma, but they want to keep it because of the circumstances and the suspicions that have been raised.
The thing about the second autopsy that really stood out to me was that 12 by 8 inch focal area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissues on the back of his head. And there were no lacerations of the overlying skin or fractures on the skull, according to the report. But can you discuss what could have caused that discoloration?
The second postmortem exam was done on a body that had been several days from being found. So we're dealing with, I believe, 2 days between when Nolan Wells was first missing and when his body was found and then autopsied, and another 4 days that have passed until the second postmortem exam. So the body is decomposed. It falls apart after death, and discoloration could be a sign of injury, like bleeding, or it could also be a sign of some sort of pressure being applied, potentially during the first autopsy itself. So this particular location on the back of the head is a common area where we place a block during the first autopsy, and that may have been the source of the discoloration, and it may have absolutely nothing to do with trauma. The only way to know is to get pieces of tissue under the microscope, and that is something that Dr. Mitchell, the pathologist who did the second autopsy, is going to be doing to look to see if that discoloration is bleeding or hemorrhage.
Why might the initial autopsy not have included a dissection of the back of the head where that discoloration was found, like the second autopsy did?
In part, a first autopsy pathologist might not autopsy that area or dissect that area because they don't see anything on the surface of the skin when the body is fresher. So they don't suspect that there's any trauma there. And they may have other parts of the body that have significant findings that they're focusing their attention on. So it's not unusual for a second autopsy pathologist who's given a body that is starting to decompose to work harder to look at areas that the first pathologist may not have looked at because they hadn't suspected injury there, since when the body was fresh, they didn't see any external signs of injury.
And we're all, of course, still waiting on that toxicology report from the initial autopsy. Yeah. Now, based on these preliminary findings that were laid out in this report and the questions that still remain about the circumstances surrounding Wells's death, could this case really come down to that toxicology report?
I doubt it. It's not a single report that answers any question. It can give you a piece of the puzzle, but you really need the scene and the circumstances. What is going to make or break this case is going to be the police investigation, finding out exactly how he got into the water, whether he was alone or whether there were other people with him at the time. That's going to make the difference in terms of determining whether it was an accident, as in an accidental drowning, or potentially a homicide.
Before we get into anything else tonight, we need to understand one term properly, because almost nothing else in this case makes sense without it. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion. That's not a phrase forensic pathologists use loosely. It means an examiner cannot simply look at a body recovered from water and write down drowning as the cause. Water can conceal almost anything. Someone can genuinely drown, or someone can die from something else entirely and end up in the water afterward. And visually, in a body that's been submerged for any length of time, those two scenarios can look remarkably similar. The only responsible way to reach drowning as a conclusion is to work backward first. Rule out head trauma, rule out neck injury, rule out drug toxicity, rule out internal damage. Only once every other explanation has genuinely been closed off does drowning become the answer written on a death certificate. Here's why that matters so much for this specific case. Within days of Nolan going missing, before any autopsy had been performed, before any pathologist had examined the body, Jackson County's sheriff told reporters publicly that there was no foul play involved. At that point in the timeline, that conclusion hadn't been earned yet. It couldn't have been. The process that's supposed to come first, ruling out everything else, hadn't happened. To be fair, it's entirely possible something at the scene shaped that statement. An observation made in the field isn't nothing. But an observation at a scene is not a documented, peer-reviewed finding, and it isn't something an outside expert can actually evaluate or verify. And a statement made on camera by a sheriff carries enormous weight with the public, whether or not the science backing it exists yet. Once officials say accident, that framing follows a case everywhere it goes afterward. It shapes how aggressively evidence gets pursued. It shapes how the public receives every new detail that surfaces later. The proper order is examine first, conclude second. In this case, that order got reversed, publicly, within days. And once it's reversed, it's genuinely difficult to undo. Quick gut check before we go further. If a sheriff stood in front of cameras and told you no foul play about your own child before a single autopsy had even happened, would you believe him because he's the authority, or would that be the exact moment your trust started to break? Comment trust the badge or trust nothing yet. We want to see which one wins tonight. Nolan's family didn't accept that reversed sequence quietly, but they also didn't respond with outrage on camera. They responded by hiring their own independent pathologist and bringing in Ben Crump. An independent autopsy was carried out on July 10th, days after Nolan's body was recovered, giving a separate examiner a chance to test the state's version against the physical evidence directly. But a second autopsy is never a clean restart, and this is the part that doesn't get said enough. By the time it happens, time has already taken its toll, and in forensic science, time destroys information. It doesn't preserve it. A body is a kind of physical record, but it's a record that fades with every passing hour. Nolan's body had already spent days in water before recovery, then went through the state's own initial autopsy, and only after all of that did the independent examiner finally get his turn. Refrigeration slows decay. It doesn't stop it. The second pathologist was, in effect, reading a document that had already been left out in the weather. The result of that independent exam wasn't accident. It wasn't homicide either. It was something more precise and more honest, undetermined. That word gets misread constantly, so let's be exact about what it actually means. Undetermined doesn't mean nothing happened. It doesn't mean the family's concerns are unfounded. It means the available evidence wasn't sufficient to close the door on any single explanation. One side delivered a fast, confident answer within days. The other side, looking far more carefully, admitted it couldn't be certain at all. That's not two experts disagreeing over interpretation. That's a trained professional declining to overstate what the evidence actually supports. Real talk before we go further. If a doctor told you undetermined about your own child, would that be an answer you could live with, or would you burn the world down demanding more? Comment, I'd accept it, or I'd demand more. Pick one. No fence sitting on this one. Now here's where Dr. Judy Melinek actually enters this case, and we need to be precise about her, because she's been mischaracterized online more than almost anyone else connected to this story. Pulled in one direction by people who want her to confirm a cover-up, pulled in the other by people who want her to shut the whole conversation down. Neither version is actually who she is on the record. Dr. Melinek is a board-certified forensic pathologist with zero connection to either side of this case. Not hired by the family, not working for the state. A completely independent, credentialed voice, reviewing what's public the same way anyone with her training would. Let's start with something she's been very clear about, because it directly undercuts one of the loudest theories circulating online. The absence of certain neck structures from Nolan's body when it reached the second pathologist has been treated by a lot of people as proof, on its own, of something being hidden. Dr. Melinek's actual position is the opposite of that. Retaining tissue or organs in a high-profile or suspicious death is common, standard forensic practice, not evidence of a cover-up. A medical examiner might keep those structures simply out of caution, whether or not anything unusual is found there. The retention itself, in her professional assessment, is not the scandal some corners of the internet have made it out to be. That doesn't mean the missing tissue doesn't matter. It matters enormously, just not for the reason people assume. It matters because the neck is exactly where evidence of strangulation would actually show up, and without it, the second examiner simply couldn't look. Not because something sinister was done with it, because that's where the answer would live, if there is one. And right now, nobody outside the state's own office has been able to check. Here's where we want you to actually think, instead of just react. We always keep certain tissue in cases like this, a real, boring, procedural explanation, or is it the kind of thing that sounds official enough that nobody questions it, even when it should be questioned? You don't have to pick the cynical answer. You don't have to pick the trusting one either. Just tell us which one you actually believe, and why. Group chat energy only tonight. Reply to each other, not just us. Now, let's get specific about the finding everyone's actually talking about, because the details matter more than the headline version. The second autopsy identified a 12 by 8-inch area of red discoloration in the deep, soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. No lacerations on the skin above it, no fractures in the skull beneath it, just discoloration in a body that had already been through days of decomposition and a full first autopsy before this second examiner ever got access to it. Here's Dr. Melinek's actual, specific explanation for what that discoloration could be, and it's more precise than decomposition as a general idea. That exact location, the back of the head, is a common spot where a block gets placed underneath a body during a standard autopsy procedure. The pressure from that block, sitting under the head during the first examination, is a real, physical, entirely mundane possible source for exactly this kind of discoloration. Not a blow, not strangulation, possibly nothing more than where a body was propped up during a routine procedure. In her own words, the only way to actually know the difference between that and real bleeding or hemorrhage is to get pieces of that tissue under a microscope, which is precisely what Dr. Mitchell, the second pathologist, still needs to do. She's also explained something that answers a question a lot of people have asked without ever getting an honest answer. Why didn't the first autopsy dissect that specific area if it turned out to matter this much? Her explanation is straightforward. A first autopsy pathologist working on a fresher body without any visible external sign of injury on the skin often won't have a reason to dissect a specific internal area if nothing on the surface points them there, especially when other parts of the body already have significant findings pulling their attention elsewhere. It's not unusual in her assessment for a second pathologist working on a body that's since begun decomposing to end up looking harder at areas the first one had no reason to suspect. That's not proof of anything hidden. It's simply how a fresh body exam and a days later exam can reasonably diverge. We're not telling you what to believe about that discoloration. We're telling you there are now two competing, both plausible explanations sitting side by side. An autopsy block or something worse, and only a microscope slide can actually tell them apart. So, block pressure or blow to the head. Say your pick in the comments and defend it. We want the real arguments, the ones where people actually change each other's minds by the end of the thread. There's one more piece of her position that deserves real weight, because it corrects a claim that spread everywhere online with total confidence. On toxicology specifically, she's been clear that any reading tied to alcohol has to be interpreted with decomposition factored in. After death, bacteria in a decomposing body can actually produce alcohol on their own, entirely separate from anything the person drank while they were alive. A number on a lab report in a body that spent days in warm water before recovery isn't automatically proof of intoxication. It could be decomposition doing exactly what decomposition does, and a careful examiner has to account for that before drawing any conclusion from it at all. And here's maybe the most important thing she's said in this entire case, the part that almost never makes it into a headline because it doesn't confirm anyone's theory. Asked directly whether this case ultimately comes down to that toxicology report, her answer was no. A single lab report doesn't answer a case like this. It's one piece of a much larger puzzle. What actually determines whether this ends up being ruled an accident or something else entirely is the police investigation itself, the scene, the circumstances, whether Nolan was truly alone in his final minutes or whether someone else was there with him. That's where this case will actually be decided, not in a lab, in the facts investigators either do or don't manage to pin down about those final minutes. Last one for this part, and we mean it. No scrolling past this without answering. Now that you've heard her full position, not just the clickbait version, does Dr. Melinek sound like someone quietly building toward cover-up, or someone genuinely too careful to say more than the evidence supports? Comment your honest read below. Tag someone who needs to actually hear her full position instead of the headline, and let's see if this comment section can actually out-argue itself by morning.
Bombshell tonight, the Nolan Wells autopsy furor. This as the FBI swoops in. Good
I find
evening.
it very difficult to believe that not one, but two medical examiners cannot figure out why he had deep red subcutaneous markings.
Different causes of death leave evidence in different locations, and when the question involves manual strangulation specifically, the evidence concentrates almost entirely in the front of the neck, not the back. The back is mostly muscle and spine. The front is where the airway sits, where the major blood vessels run, and where the physical signs of pressure would actually appear, if they exist at all. That's the region forensic pathologists call the neck block, and it's exactly the region that was retained by the state and never released with the rest of Nolan's body when it went to the second examiner. There are three specific things a forensic examiner looks for in a case like this, and understanding all three actually matters, because right now, nobody outside the state's own office has been able to check for any of them. First, the hyoid bone, a small, delicate, horseshoe-shaped bone that sits high in the front of the throat. Unlike most bones in the body, it's largely unprotected, floating, essentially, held in place by muscle rather than sitting against other bone the way most of the skeleton does. In some manual strangulation cases, it can fracture under pressure. Its condition, intact or broken, is one of the clearest physical signals a pathologist can look for. Second, the strap muscles, thin muscles running down the front of the neck, just under the skin. Under compression, tiny blood vessels inside them can rupture internally, leaving signs a trained eye can detect, even when there's nothing visible on the surface at all. Third, petechiae. Pinpoint hemorrhages that appear when small blood vessels burst from sustained pressure, often found in the eyes, the face, or the lining of the heart. On their own, none of these three signs proves anything conclusively. Together, they form a recognizable pattern, and pattern recognition is the actual foundation of how forensic pathology works. All three of those signs live in exactly the region that was retained and never handed over, which means, right now, tonight, nobody independent of the state has been able to confirm or rule out any of them. Here's the question we actually want fought out in the comments. If you were the parent in this situation, would its common practice to retain that tissue be enough to make you feel okay with not knowing? Or would you want it released the second a second opinion was requested, procedure or not? Comment, procedure is fine, or release it now. Then go argue with the people who picked differently than you. That's what tonight's comments section is actually for. To be fair, and we're going to keep being fair about this the whole way through, retaining tissue during an investigation isn't automatically suspicious on its own. Medical examiners do this regularly, sometimes to preserve material for further study, sometimes specifically to hold it as evidence precisely because something was found. On its own, retention proves nothing wrong. But here's why it still matters, and why it's normal doesn't fully settle the question either. If the state retained that tissue, the state also examined that tissue. Whatever they found from it exists somewhere, already, in the first autopsy report, a report the public still hasn't seen. The retention itself isn't the scandal. The silence sitting on top of it, for this long, is the part that actually deserves scrutiny. There's a second complication sitting right next to this one, and it's simple on paper but genuinely misleading if you don't know to look for it. Toxicology. A number on a lab report looks objective. It isn't, automatically, in a case like this. We covered why, in Part 1, decomposition can generate its own alcohol, entirely separate from anything Nolan actually drank. In bodies that have undergone significant decomposition, that internally generated alcohol can climb high enough to cross a legal threshold based purely on bacterial activity, not behavior. Given how many days Nolan's body spent in water before recovery, any toxicology reading tied to alcohol needs to be read with that decomposition factored in, not taken at face value. Anyone treating a raw number as proof of intoxication without that context is working with an incomplete picture, whichever direction they're trying to push the story. Now, the part nobody expected this week. Here's where this case just moved in a way that connects directly back to something we've covered before. The disputed audio from that emergency call, the one where people online swear they hear a name, a question, a warning. At the National Urban League Convention, standing next to Nolan's parents, Ben Crump made an announcement that changes the entire conversation around that audio. His team has retained some of the top audio engineering experts in the country to formally review the original CETO call in its entirety. Not a clip, not a 15-second excerpt, the whole recording, professionally, forensically. Think about what this actually changes. For weeks, every version of what's really being said in that recording has come from someone outside any formal process. A content creator running it through AI, an audio engineer posting her own pass on social media, commentators arguing over what they personally think they hear. None of it authenticated. None of it done by someone with the training, the tools, and the direct involvement in this specific case that a formally retained expert would have. That changes now. This is the first time a review of that audio is actually being conducted by people directly engaged by the family's own legal team. with the credibility and the resources to potentially settle, once and for all, what is and isn't actually on that recording. We want your honest prediction, not just your hope. When these experts actually finish their review, do you think it confirms something disturbing in that audio? Or do you think it comes back and says the disputed sections are simply too degraded to say anything conclusive either way? Comment confirms something or inconclusive. Whoever's wrong has to admit it when the results actually come out. We're holding you to it. Crump also announced something else in that same breath that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. His team has brought in oceanic engineering experts specifically to examine the tides. Here's the exact tension he raised, in his own words at the podium. Nolan's body was reportedly found in essentially the same location where his friends say they left him. Crump's question is straightforward and, frankly, hard to argue with on its face. How is that possible, accounting for the actual tidal movement in that stretch of water over 2 full days? Low tide, high tide, current, drift. All of it should have moved a body significantly over that span, and Crump is saying publicly that the math, as it's been presented so far, isn't adding up. We need to be fair here, the same way we've been fair about everything else tonight. We don't have the oceanic engineering findings yet. Nobody does. This review was just announced. It's entirely possible there's a mundane, current-based explanation for why a body might stay closer to a starting point than people assume, depending on wind, depth, and exactly where in the water someone actually was. It's also entirely possible Crump is right that something about this specific detail doesn't hold up under real scrutiny. We're not going to pretend we know which one it is before the actual experts have said anything. What we can tell you is that this is now a formal, professionally examined question instead of just a suspicion floating online, and that distinction matters enormously for where this case goes next. Last thing before we move on. Genuinely, do you think official investigators should have brought in tide experts themselves months ago instead of it taking the family's own legal team to do it? Or is this exactly the kind of detail that gets checked quietly, behind the scenes, without a press conference attached to it? Say what you actually think. We want disagreement in this thread, not a chorus. There's a sentence Dr. Roger Mitchell said publicly that deserves far more attention than it's gotten, because it reframes the entire question this case is actually trying to answer. Saying Nolan drowned, in Dr. Mitchell's own words, doesn't actually tell you what happened to him. Drowning can be the honest, technical cause of death and still leave the most important questions completely open. Was he conscious when he went into the water, or unconscious? Was he forced in, or did he go in on his own? Those questions don't get answered by a cause of death at all. They get answered by everything around it, and right now, everything around it is still incomplete. That incompleteness isn't abstract, it's specific, and Ben Crump laid out exactly what's still missing at the podium. His team is actively working to coordinate with Dr. Mitchell to finally get access to the throat structures that were retained by the state and never released with the body. Alongside that, they're hoping to get Dr. Mitchell direct access to the photographs and observations made by the state medical examiner's office at the moment Nolan was first discovered. Because by the time Dr. Mitchell actually got his hands on the body, on July 10th, the airway and the lungs had already been dissected by the state's own examiner. Without that, Dr. Mitchell couldn't determine whether there was water present in them at all, which is one of the most basic physical indicators of whether someone actually drowned versus died some other way first. Sit with that for a second before we move on, and tell us honestly what you think. Dr. Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist, president of the National Medical Association, didn't have access to the lungs, the airway, or the throat when he examined Nolan's body. Is that just how autopsies sequence when there are two of them, Or is it genuinely hard to accept that the independent examiner was working with less than half the picture? Sequencing or suspicious? Pick one. Argue it out below. Here's what's actually being requested now, and it's worth being precise about it because precision is the only thing that keeps a story like this honest. Nobody is asking for the state to hand over evidence and disappear from the process. What's being pursued is access. Dr. Mitchell getting to examine what the state already has, directly, so an independent expert can finally look at the exact tissue capable of confirming or ruling out strangulation, instead of that determination living entirely inside one office's private files. To be fair to the state's side of this, retaining evidence during an active investigation and being cautious about who gets access to it isn't inherently obstruction. If there's an active criminal investigation running in parallel, controlling access to physical evidence is often exactly what a prosecutor's office is supposed to do, to protect the integrity of whatever comes next. A grand jury, potential charges, a future trial. Both of those things can be true at once. The retention can be procedurally normal, and the family can still have every right to push, hard, for their own expert to finally get a real look. Neither side is automatically wrong here. That's exactly why this is still an open, contested question instead of a settled one. The phones nobody's been talking about. Now here's a detail from that same press conference that's genuinely new, and it hasn't gotten anywhere near the attention it deserves, because everyone's been so focused on one phone specifically. Attorney Eric Herz, part of the family's legal team, gave an update that widens this entire thread. According to him, the district attorney's office has responded, in writing, expressing willingness to consider some of the evidence the family's team has gathered, though the specifics of what gets shared back and forth are still being worked out. More importantly, both sides have reached what he described as a tentative agreement to move forward with a joint investigation of the phones, plural, not just the phones belonging to the family's own clients. Other phones connected to this case as well. Think about what that actually implies for a second, because it's easy to skip past a plural word without registering what it means. This entire case, for weeks, has been framed publicly around Nolan's phone specifically, what was or wasn't deleted from it, why it looked the way it did when his family finally got it back. If multiple phones are now part of a joint, coordinated investigation, that means investigators aren't just asking what happened to Nolan's device. They're asking what's on other devices too, devices belonging to people who were there that day, on that boat, on that island. That's a meaningfully bigger scope than anything that's been publicly confirmed before this announcement. Real question, and we want your gut answer, not your careful one. If you were one of the friends on that boat, and investigators told you your own phone was now part of a joint forensic review, would that feel like standard procedure to you, or would it feel like the walls closing in? My phone, no problem, or I'd be terrified. Say which one, and say why. Don't just agree with the first comment you see, actually think about it. Hertz also confirmed something that ties directly back to everything we covered in Part 2. He said he believes the FBI will be present for this joint phone review, which lines up exactly with what's already been separately confirmed elsewhere, the Bureau assisting with digital evidence specifically, as a supporting resource for the local investigation, not a takeover of it. Having federal forensic resources physically present for this specific examination is a real, meaningful step up in capability from what any single side could do alone. According to Hertz, that presence is going to reveal information nobody involved in this case has been able to see yet. We want to be honest about the limits of what we actually know here, too. The same way we've been honest about the limits of everything else tonight. Tentative agreement is not the same as already happening. A letter expressing willingness to listen is not the same as evidence actually changing hands. Everything Hertz described tonight is a real, meaningful step forward, but it's a step, not an arrival. The actual joint examination, if and when it happens, is what will finally start answering the questions this case has been sitting on for weeks. Last one for this part. Do you think a joint examination, family's experts and the state's experts, in the room together, at the same time, is actually going to produce an answer everyone accepts? Or do you think whichever side doesn't like the result is just going to claim the process was rigged anyway? Tell us honestly. We're not convinced either way, and we want to hear yours.
So we can't tell if there was the presence of water or not. That would suggest whether he drowned or not. And remember what Dr. Roger Mitchell said in his autopsy. President Mariel, he talked about the fact that to say he drowned does not draw the conclusions of what happened to Nolan Wells. He said it is equally important to know at what condition was Nolan Wells' body when he went into the water. Was he conscious or was he unconscious? Was he forced into the water or did he go unforced into the water? He said all of these things are very important. And so we're dotting I's and crossing T's. We are focused on getting to the truth, and we stand for the truth. Me and everybody on my legal team stand for the truth, no matter who it implicates or who it exonerates. Yes. We stand for justice, no matter who it convicts or who it acquits. And we stand for transparency, so everybody can see. And that's all we want. We want answers. We're not casting aspersions on anybody. We are saying that we want to make sure everybody who is remotely involved has their questions answered to make sure we have a full and fair and impartial and transparent investigation. And is that too much to ask for these broken-hearted parents? Is that too much to ask? That's all. If it was your child, wouldn't you want the same thing? And I get it. They're attacking me. They're attacking Reverend Al. They're attacking the parents of Nolan Wells. We don't care about those distractions. We ain't no ways tired. We are completely focused, completely laser focused on getting to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help us, God.
Near the end of that press conference, a reporter identifying herself as being with the New York Post asked Ben Crump directly about something that hasn't been widely reported yet, a threat to sue him and Nolan's own family for defamation. His answer was fast, and it was pointed. He called it a distraction, said it wasn't slowing them down at all, and made clear the family's entire focus was on getting to the truth, not on responding to legal threats aimed at silencing them. When pressed further, he declined to give the accusation any more airtime, saying plainly that it didn't deserve a response and that he wasn't going to spend energy arguing with people trying to distract from 3 dead young men under suspicious circumstances. We need to slow down on this because it's a genuinely serious development, regardless of which side of this case you're on. A threat to sue a grieving family for defamation over statements made publicly while actively searching for answers about their own son's death is not a small thing to float, and it's not a small thing to dismiss either. If that threat is real and moves forward, it becomes its own separate legal fight, layered on top of everything else this family is already carrying. If it's not moving forward and was only ever a threat meant to intimidate, that's its own kind of serious problem too, because threatening a defamation suit against grieving parents without following through is exactly the kind of thing that can function as pressure rather than as an actual legal claim. Here's what we actually want argued out tonight. Is threatening a defamation lawsuit against grieving parents while they're actively searching for what happened to their child a legitimate legal response to being publicly named? Or is it a pressure tactic dressed up as one? They have a right to sue, or this is intimidation. Pick a side and defend it. We want real disagreement in this thread by tonight. Crump also addressed something else worth including here, because it's the kind of detail that gets weaponized in both directions online. Asked, in effect, about his own financial stake in cases like this, he responded that he's a lawyer like any other lawyer, and that he should get paid for his work the same way any attorney would, comparing it directly to how nobody questions whether a corporate defense attorney or an insurance lawyer gets paid for theirs. That's a fair point on its own terms. It's also fair for people watching this case to want transparency about exactly how these cases are funded, who's paying for what, and where the money raised publicly is actually going. Both of those things can be true, and neither one, by itself, tells you anything about whether the underlying case has merit. Why Nashville? And why these three families together? Here's something worth understanding about the setting of everything we've covered tonight, because it changes how you should read all of it. This wasn't a standalone Nolan Wells press conference. It happened at the National Urban League's National Convention, and Crump didn't come alone. He brought the families of two other young black men, whose deaths, within roughly the same 3-month window around the summer of 2026, followed patterns his legal team has described as strikingly similar, including Daniel Irvin's case out of Texas, which we've covered in depth in a previous update on this channel, and a newer case out of Lexington, Kentucky, involving an 18-year-old named Tyler Smith. We're going to keep this part deliberately brief, and there's a real reason for that. The reporting and first-hand accounts around Tyler Smith's case that have reached us so far are less clear and less consistent than what we have on Nolan's case or Daniel Irvin's, and we're not willing to build out details we can't verify cleanly, about people we can't confidently identify, just to fill time. What we can tell you, at the level we're actually confident in, is this. According to what was said publicly in Nashville, Tyler Smith died on the same 4th of July weekend as Nolan, the only black person at a small gathering, from what was initially described to his family as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His family has publicly disputed key details of that account, and the case has reportedly moved slowly since. We're being upfront that this is thinner ground than everything else in tonight's video, and that matters. Would you rather we cover a case like this cautiously, in broad strokes, until we can verify more, or skip it entirely until it's fully confirmed, even if that means you hear about it here last? Cautious coverage, or wait for full confirmation? Tell us which one you'd actually want from a channel like this. The reason Crump brought these three families together in the same room matters beyond any one individual case. His argument, stated directly at the podium, is that all three cases share a recognizable shape: a young black man, gone under circumstances that don't initially draw full scrutiny, an early institutional response that closes the door faster than the evidence actually supports, and a family left fighting, on their own, to force a real investigation open. Whether that shared shape reflects something structural, or whether these are simply three separate tragedies that happen to share surface similarities, is exactly the question this entire event was built to put in front of the public. And it's not a question either side of this conversation gets to answer by themselves. We want to say something plainly here, because it's easy to lose sight of in a video this dense with legal strategy and forensic detail. Whatever you believe about any single piece of evidence in Nolan's case, three families are sitting in the same room because they've each lost a son under circumstances that haven't been fully explained to their satisfaction. That's not a detail to argue past. That's the actual center of everything we've covered tonight. Last one for this part. Do you think bringing three separate cases together like this strengthens each individual case? More attention, more pressure, more scrutiny across the board? Or does it risk diluting Nolan's own case specifically by asking people to hold 3 different sets of facts in their head at once? Stronger together or dilutes each one? Say which, and say why. We want to see this thread actually split.